Hey guys, welcome back to my channel if you've been here before, and if you haven't, welcome to my channel. Here at In Your Hands Tarot, I like to do unboxings, flip-throughs, review type videos on various different tarot and oracle decks, and much more. So for today's video, I have the whole crew with me. This is only some of them. You will see the rest of them later on in the video. But today I want to be talking with you guys about the tarot decks that I have in my collection that I believe are good for beginner tarot readers or people who are interested in learning more about tarot and are kind of looking for maybe their first deck. So I've split my collection up into two groups, and the group that I have here are the decks that I believe are good beginner decks, and then later on in the video I will show you the ones that I believe maybe aren't really the best for beginners. I feel like they're maybe better off suited for people who are a little more knowledgeable or a little more advanced in reading tarot, which is funny because I'm still a beginner myself and I feel like I have quite a few decks that I can't even really, I still use them, but I definitely don't use them as much as I use these ones, because at the moment for me, this group here is definitely better suited for me and where I am right now on my tarot journey. So I just want to start off by saying that this is just my personal opinion, and I am basing it on my experiences that I've had with working with each of these decks. What works for me may not work for you, and vice versa. That's just, you know, how the world works. So definitely don't just take my word for it. Do your research, you know, look at flip through videos and review videos if that's kind of what you do to help you decide if a deck is going to be a good match for you. That is something that I definitely do before purchasing a new deck. Is I look to several resources. I Google, I YouTube, because I want to get a good feel of the deck and see if it is going to be a good fit for me before I make the purchase. Granted, sometimes you don't really get the true feel of it unless you have it with you and you're holding it in your hands, and only then can you really kind of feel if you mesh well together. But it's definitely a good idea to do a bit more research beforehand before making the purchase. And speaking of flip throughs and review videos, I believe for every single one of my decks that I'm going to show you in this video, I'm pretty sure I have one for all of them. I have posted either unboxings or flip throughs for each of the decks here, and then some of the decks I have also posted reviews on. So if you want more of an in-depth look at a specific deck, you can go on over to my videos and scroll through the list, and you should be able to find either a flip through or a review. So with all of that being said, let's jump right into it. So the decks that I have here with me now are the Everyday Witch Tarot, the Radiant Wise Spirit Tarot, the Light Seers Tarot, Modern Witch, and the Luna Soul Tarot. So I have chosen each of these decks to be in this group because I feel like all of them share similar qualities that make them good beginner decks. Each one of these contains a very well written and very descriptive guidebook, which in my opinion is a very important thing that a deck needs to have, especially as a beginner reader. I know personally I look to the guidebook very often. I feel like there's only been a few times so far where I have done a whole reading where I didn't need to use the guidebook, but other than that, I definitely always need to have it nearby. I want to talk about the Everyday Witch Tarot while we're talking about guidebooks, because in my opinion, this deck has one of the best guidebooks. They definitely don't cheap out on the information provided. It is a hefty size book. It is broken up into several different chapters, And throughout the book, there are also pages where you can jot down some notes, which is also a very important thing that you may want to do as a newbie reader. So if we take a look at each of the majors in this book, each one has a picture of the card and a good amount of information to describe its meaning, which is super, super helpful. And then if we jump over to the minors, again, we are given a picture of the card and still a good amount of information. I feel like in a lot of guidebooks, they give way more information on the majors rather than the minors. I usually tend to see there are more paragraphs when they're describing the majors, and then when you get to the minors, there's maybe like one paragraph to describe each card. But in the Everyday Witch Tarot, I feel like every single card, whether it be a major or a minor, has a significant amount of information that is super easy to read and understand. For me, when I read a guidebook that is written in a way that is similar to how I talk or how I like to write, it makes it a lot easier for me to grasp the concept of each card a lot faster. When I'm reading a guidebook that kind of uses more complex wording, or just it's written in a way that I don't really relate to, I don't really talk in that way, or maybe they use words that I've never heard to describe a card, so now I have to go to Google and try to figure out the meaning of that word to better understand the meaning of the card. It's kind of inconvenient when I have to do that. So when I get a guidebook that just resonates with me and it's super easy to understand, it is a huge pro for me. Now I'm gonna hop over to the lovely Light Seers Tarot. So the big win for me with this deck is definitely the imagery on the cards. A big thing for me when I'm looking at the imagery is definitely reading the body language, the facial expressions, the colors of the cards. So if the imagery is well done, then that just makes it a lot quicker for you to kind of get a grasp on what is being portrayed within the image. And I feel like the Light Seers Tarot does a really, really good job at doing that. It's very clear for the reader on the type of emotion and energy that is being portrayed within each of the cards. The artwork is just so well done that you can kind of figure it out without even really having to turn to the guidebook. At least for me, this is one deck that I can kind of use without having to constantly be reaching for the guidebook. And apart from all that, the cards are just really beautiful. The colors are insane. There's so much design in each of them, so much detail. They really are phenomenal cards. The guidebook, along with the Everyday Witch, is very well written also. Good amount of information for each of the cards, and it's a good sized book too. It's not like a tiny little thin book. It's pretty thick, has a bit of weight to it, so it's definitely a good guidebook. Another quality that each one of these cards has is they all tend to use the same symbolism, and the imagery tends to mirror that of the original Rider-Waite-Smith deck. And I am a beginner who really wanted to learn by learning the Rider-Waite-Smith deck first, but I had a hard time connecting with the original deck that I have, so I ended up purchasing the Radiant Wise Spirit Tarot instead, and I just clicked with this one instantly. It is still my go-to favorite deck to use. The imagery is the exact same as the original Rider-Waite-Smith. It's just definitely more enhanced in its color. It's borderless, which is also something that I love. but what is being portrayed in the imagery is the exact same as the original. But the big thing for this deck for me as a beginner, apart from the cards being incredibly beautiful, is the guidebook. This too is also a very well written guidebook. We have reversals explained in here as well, which is super helpful, especially for a beginner. I know not everybody uses reversals, but I feel like it's still good to know as somebody who's just starting out, and then as you go, you can maybe sort of feel whether or not reversals are going to be something that you want to use. I use reversals, so when I come across a guidebook that explains them as well, I love it, and I think it's super helpful. You don't have to use the original Rider-Waite-Smith imagery to learn tarot. You can definitely learn through any deck that you want and any imagery that you want. But for me personally, I really wanted to get down the original deck before sort of branching out to other types of decks. But as you go on to purchase more decks, you are definitely going to notice that a lot of the symbolism and the imagery is the same as the Rider-Waite-Smith. Next, I want to look at the Modern Witch. So very similar to the other decks that I just talked about. The imagery in this deck is also very well done. It for sure has that modern twist to it, which I feel like a lot of people would actually like because it's definitely relatable. In my opinion, this imagery is also very easy to understand. It is very clear throughout the deck, and each of the cards kind of what story is being told and what mood and energy is supposed to be represented through each individual card. And this is just an overall fun, colorful deck as well. I was gonna say that that isn't really an important thing when it comes to finding a good beginner deck, but then I was kind of thinking to myself, it kind of is. Like, if you're not drawn to the imagery, if the colors aren't really doing it for you, or just the overall design and look of each of the cards, you're not going to click with it. And I mean, it's definitely different for each individual reader, for sure. Like I said, something that I like, maybe you wouldn't like it, or a deck that works for someone else may not work for me, because I know that there are a lot of decks out there that people use that I see online, and I have tried to, you know, do some research on it because it's piqued my interest, but as I'm watching the flip throughs or the review videos, I'm just not resonating with it at all. So definitely depends on each individual reader. But kind of as like a side note, definitely get a deck that you're drawn to the imagery. You like the look of the cards. They don't hurt your eyes when you have to look at them, because you're going to be looking at them a lot. So you definitely want something that is going to be easy on the eyes, which in my opinion, I feel like this deck definitely is if you like this kind of look to the cards. We have another well done guidebook, and this one is actually, it's kind of funny because out of all the guidebooks, this one is probably the most relatable because of the wording and just overall how it's written. There's even like swear words used within this book, which when I first read that, I thought it was hilarious because just seeing that made me like it even more. But apart from all of that, the description is also very well done, very clear, easy to understand. Not a huge amount of information, like it's about a paragraph per card, but again, if you do need a bit more clarification, there are other resources out there that you can take a look at, but I definitely feel like the way that they have written each one is quite clear and at least gives you some sense to the meanings of the cards. And then last but not least, we have the very cute Luna Soul Tarot. Now this is the newest addition to my collection, so I haven't really done a whole lot of work with it, but from the work that I have done with this deck, in my opinion, it is a good beginner deck because, again, the imagery very easy to understand, very well done. The palette of this deck is very soft. It's a very soft, calming, relaxing deck, which doesn't necessarily make it good for a beginner, but for this beginner, I feel like that is definitely a quality that I do enjoy within the decks that I use. There is one thing about this deck though that I'm not sure how it would go over with a beginner, is that there are 2 additional cards that have been added. And at first I thought the additional cards were cool, and I still do, but I feel like as a beginner, you kind of really want to focus on the original 78 cards. Like, you kind of want to focus on getting those down pat before turning your attention and focus on studying some additional cards, you know? So if you wanted to, if you were trying to just focus on the original 78, you could totally just remove these cards from your deck if you wanted to, and then once you've felt like you've got the other cards down pat, you could add them back in later, or just keep them in, and whenever you get them, just turn to the guidebook and see their meaning, unless you've used the deck enough that you no longer need the guidebook. But this is another well done book, about the same amount of information as the Modern Witch Tarot. But again, it's written in a way that makes it quite easy for me to understand. So yeah, those are really the 2 major things that I look for when I'm looking for a deck that is good for a beginner. Is definitely the guidebook, because right now I am at the stage of my tarot journey where I still rely on the guidebook for assistance. I try not to. I definitely try to look at the cards and figure it out myself before reaching for the guidebook, but then that's kind of where the imagery comes into play. You're gonna want to have nice, clear imagery where it's not a struggle for you to pick up on the feel of the card. If I'm not able to look at the imagery and figure it out myself, then I have no choice really but to reach for the guidebook or go to another resource to figure it out. So well-designed imagery is very important to me, along with a very well-written, easy-to-understand guidebook. And in my opinion, each one of these decks has both of those things. So just a reminder, if you want more of an in-depth look at each of these decks, check out my other videos, because I definitely have unboxings and flip throughs for all of them. I know that I just recently posted a review video of the Lunasol Tarot, if you want to go and check that out. But yeah, feel free to take a gander over to my videos section, because you may find something that will help shed some more light on each of these decks. So now I want to talk about the decks in my collection that I don't really use, because in my personal opinion, they're not the most beginner friendly. These are the decks that I tend to struggle with the most when either trying to look at the imagery to figure out the cards, or even the guidebook. And again, I've picked these cards to go into this group because I feel like they also share similar qualities that have made them not the best decks for me to use as a beginner. So I'm gonna start off with the very lovely Magical Nordic Tarot. The guidebook is not the issue for me, not at all. It is a very well done guidebook. Plenty of description given for each of the cards, which is really great. My only problem with this deck is, if we take a look at the cards, for the minors, this is the imagery. It is the suit, and then however many the card is representing. So we have the 5 of Cups here. Here are 5 of Cups in the imagery. 6 of Cups, we have 6 cups. So there isn't anything to go off of as a newbie. I can't look at this card and look at the emotion that's being portrayed or feel the energy or anything like that, because there isn't really anything given. The only sort of hint that is given is there is either like a word or a couple words at the bottom that shed a bit of light on the meaning of the card. But apart from that, there isn't really anything else to go off of. If you are not a beginner and you're someone who has been doing tarot for quite some time and you know the meanings of all of the cards, then this deck would be no trouble for you at all. But for someone who is still learning, like myself, who doesn't know all of the card meanings yet, and who still very heavily relies on the imagery to help you figure it out, this, in my opinion, is definitely not the best go-to beginner deck. And even for the cards that do have pictures on them, there isn't really a whole lot going on. Like, the expressions on the faces are very solemn. There isn't really a whole lot going on. Everyone's face kind of looks the same, like the emotion is the same. No one really looks happy, even if it's a card that should be happy. Everyone just kind of has their eyes closed and it's just kind of that same face over and over again. So, okay, so we have the Fool here. He's showing a little bit of emotion, but again, it's not a lot. It's not a lot of detail within the cards. So I feel like as a beginner, I have a hard time trying to decipher this imagery on my own without the guidebook. Okay, next I want to take a look at the Crow Tarot. This is actually one of my favorite decks, and it was one of my first decks also. The guidebook is great. It's very descriptive, easy to understand. It is everything that you kind of want in a guidebook. It's good. The only problem that I have with this deck on a beginner level is the fact that it's an animal deck. I feel like those, at least for me as a beginner, are not the best to learn with, because again, I'm relying on the emotion of the people, I'm relying on the body language, and when it's an animal deck, that's kind of hard to read. The cards in this deck are stunning. The imagery is very beautiful, but because it's an animal deck, I have a hard time reading the imagery without using the guidebook. And because the guidebook is so well written, I just kind of find myself instantly grabbing it when I'm doing a reading, and I don't even really try to figure it out on my own, which is not something that I want to be doing as a newbie. I want to try and, you know, practice and put what I've learned so far to the test and not have to rely on the guidebook so much. But for me, when it comes to an animal deck, it's very hard for me to read on my own. One thing I do like about the imagery though, even though it is an animal deck, it definitely still mirrors the Rider-Waite-Smith a lot of the time. But I do feel like the more that I'm learning, I am actually able to better understand this deck more so than I did back when I first started. And the next deck that I want to talk about is the Very Cute Cat Tarot. Now, I want to say that I knew before I bought this deck that this wasn't going to be the best one for learning. I already knew that ahead of time because it is an animal deck. Yes, the imagery is very cute, but similar to the Crow Tarot, hard for me to read without using the guidebook. So I just want to compare the Fool card in the Cat Tarot to the Fool card in the Rider-Waite. So if we take a look at the Fool over here, it's a very popular image. We're all very familiar with this person who is walking towards the edge of a cliff, kind of looks very carefree, like no care in the world. He's got his things that he needs with him over his shoulder here. His little dog here is trying his best to warn him of what's to come. Like, we all kind of know that sort of symbolism. But if we take a look at the Cat Tarot, the Fool, I don't see really any resemblance at all to this card. We have a cat here who I guess his face could kind of give off that he's a little like naive, or like doesn't really, like, what's the word, like spacey maybe. He's not really, he doesn't know what's about to happen. He looks a little lost almost. But the only real indicator, at least for me, that would symbolize like the start of something, if I'm looking at this imagery, would really just be the number 0 at the top here. That lets me know that this is the beginning of something. Other than that, I would not get the same sort of message that I get from this card when I look at this one. So that's why I definitely feel like the Cat Tarot is a good deck, but for someone who is already pretty knowledgeable in the meanings of each of the cards. Don't get me wrong, it is a super cute deck. I love this deck, and I do use it when I am kind of maybe feeling down and I need a little bit of a pick-me-up. This is definitely a deck that I will go to for that, but I do have a hard time reading this one on my own. And also within this deck, the only cards that say what they are the court cards. So you got your pages, your knights, and your queens and your kings, and that's it. The rest of them don't tell you what they are, so I have a really hard time knowing what this card even is if it doesn't tell me. Oh yeah, and the majors tell you also, but other than that, throughout the minors, it does not tell you what each of the cards are, so I have no idea. So I have to go looking through the guidebook every single time if I get a minor, because I don't have a clue. The guidebook, so not a whole lot of information within this guidebook. So if we take a look at the majors, we have a picture here and then about a paragraph, and for the reversed, a couple sentences describing each of the cards. In my opinion, that is not really enough for a beginner. It definitely was not enough for me, and that is another reason why I don't tend to use this deck a whole heck of a lot. And if we flip on over to the minors, kind of have a bit more information with the minors, which I think is funny because, like I said before, I felt like usually the majors are the ones that get more of a description compared to the minors, but in the Cat Tarot, I definitely feel like the minors are getting more of the attention within this guidebook. But maybe this will be a deck that I use sometime in the future when I've become more knowledgeable on the card meanings, because it is super fun and cute. And last but not least, I want to take a look at the original Rider-Waite-Smith deck. So a lot of people say that this is a very good beginner deck, and for a lot of people it probably is. But for me, it was not. I could not resonate with these cards. I did not click with them. We didn't mesh well together. But it was funny because I still wanted to use this imagery to learn. I still wanted to learn all the card meanings by using these cards. I just couldn't use this particular deck, which is why I ended up purchasing the Radiant Wise Spirit Tarot instead, and instantly I clicked with that one, and it's my favorite deck. But it was just funny how it's the same imagery, just the colors are, this deck has more of like an older sort of look and feel to it. But the one thing, besides the fact that I just didn't resonate with the cards, another thing that I kind of wasn't a huge fan of was the guidebook. Reading the descriptions, I had a hard time kind of understanding what they were talking about, and there wasn't like a whole lot of information given, or not a whole lot of description. So I don't know if you've grasped this about me yet, but when it comes to guidebooks, description is very, very important to me. I love a lot of description, a lot of detail, because it helps me understand things a lot quicker. And in my opinion, compared to some of the other guidebooks that I've talked about today, this one just doesn't do it for me. It definitely uses more complex wording from what I'm used to, So this is a good example of a guidebook that I would have to do a lot of Googling with when I would come across a word that I have never heard before. And to me, that was just a pain in the butt to do. So I ended up looking for another version of this deck and ended up liking that one a whole lot better, thankfully. So yeah, those are the decks I have in my collection that didn't really work so well for me as a beginner. Now that I'm learning more and more, using some of these decks aren't as difficult as it used to be, but definitely in the beginning when I first started reading tarot, I very rarely would reach for these ones. So I hope I was able to shed a bit of light on some of these decks. If you're looking for your first tarot deck, again, do more research. Don't just take my word for it. I love every single deck that I have in my collection, whether I use them a whole lot or not. Each one definitely holds a special place in my heart. But yeah, some of them just work better for me than others, which I'm pretty sure every reader can relate to. I'm pretty sure we've all been there when it comes to our tarot collections. We have the ones that just click and resonate with us the most, and then we have the ones that kind of just sit there and look pretty and be cute and we'll use them from time to time. But yeah, and once again, this was just my own personal opinion through my experiences with using each of these decks. So thank you so much for watching this video. I hope you enjoyed it and found it to be helpful in some way, and I shall see you guys next time.